Shalom Havarim. Pleased to have you here. This teaching is going to be entitled Understanding the Halacha of Yeshua. Halacha is a term that we use in Judaism to refer to how we carry out the Torah, how we keep the Torah. It comes from a term meaning literally to walk or the way to walk. It's basically how we walk the Torah. And there's just not enough information in the written Torah by itself to fully implement Torah in real life. A lot of conflicts arise, questions come up. Do we keep this, this commandment or that commandment? Because what does a commandment really mean, etc. And so to deal with this, we have what's called Halacha. Halacha is the rest of the story, if you will, how we actually observe the Torah. And Halacha was quite fluid in the Second Temple era. There were a lot of debates and discussions going on. There were Torah courts, like we see described in the Torah, set up there were to resolve conflicts and questions, and similar to like court precedents when cases would be heard and decisions would be made as to what the weight, and we'll talk about that, of a particular mitzvah is versus another mitzvah, or just what a mitzvah means, how to carry out a mitzvah, and to resolve questions that sometimes the written Torah doesn't in and of itself resolve. So, as I said, in the first century, Halacha was rather fluid. You had differing sects of Judaism, each with their own Halacha. You had Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, and of course Nazarenes and Hellenists. And the Nazarenes had their own unique Halacha. We may do a whole different video on explaining the halachic authority of Nazarene Judaism versus Pharisaic Judaism and Essene Judaism, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today is the halacha itself and the basis for it. And this is going to be far from an extensive. This is going to be sort of an outline of basic understanding. And if you go to NazareneSpace.com and find NazareneSpace.com/blog and find this video there, you'll have a link to, if you're watching on YouTube or whatever, you'll find a link to the PDF file that is the handouts for this video. And so we have a set of handouts here. And as I said, in Rabbinic, in Judaism in the Second Temple era, you had these differing sects of Judaism. And I mentioned the Pharisees, for example. And the Pharisees weren't a fully united group in the Second Temple era. You had different groups among them. You had the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai were the two primary groups, and they were constantly debating Halacha, and they had two different schools of thought of Halacha. They had over 350 at least debates between the two schools recorded in the Talmud. And according to the Zohar, the school of Hillel was concerned with the spirit of the Torah, and the school of Shammai was concerned. Well, the school of Hillel was actually rooted in Chesed, and the school of Shammai was rooted in Gevorah, according to the Zohar. It's said that the school of Hillel concentrated on the spirit of the Torah, while the school of Shammai concentrated on the letter of the Torah. And then, of course, you had the Essenes, who were even stricter than the school of Shammai, and of course, we're going to discuss, of course, the Nazarenes. But first, let's cover a couple of basic principles of Rabbinic Halacha that will be helpful as we move along here. Rabbinic Judaism is the successor to Pharisaic Judaism of the Second Temple era, and primarily of the school of Hillel. And The couple of principles I want to point out, there are many more. I do not have anywhere near enough time to give a full lecture on all the principles of Rabbinic Halacha. But two primary ones I want to cover is one, the concept of weight. uh, this is the first rule of Hillel, which is called Kol Vechomer, light and heavy. And it's the idea that one mitzvah may outweigh another mitzvah, another commandment. The illustration I like to give is a person's on a ship, and maybe I won't use that illustration because it plays too far into the next principle I want to cover. Excuse me. So let me give you an example. One that we find in Matthew chapter 15, but we also find it in Derive 9, I believe, in the Mishnah. Let's say that somebody makes a vow, and keeping that vow, because the Torah says keep your vows, keeping the vow would result in dishonoring their parents, their father or their mother. So now they're faced with a dilemma. Do I violate the Torah commandment that says to keep your vows, or do I violate the Torah commandment that says to honor your parents? And both matters are dealt with. One's dealt with by Yeshua in Matthew chapter 15, and it's also dealt with in Derive chapter 9, I believe, in the Mishnah. And they both come to the same conclusion, that the commandment to honor parents outweighs the commandment to keep vows. So a vow is loosed if the matter of honor to a parent is at issue. And in Derive 9, I believe this is only true if the vow only involves the two parties, the person to whom the vow was made and the person who would dishonor their parents. If other parties are involved, it's not loosed. But in Matthew chapter 15 doesn't go into that issue. It just says that the honoring your parents outweighs keeping the vow. All right. So that's an example, by the way, of one of Yeshua's halachot, and you'll notice that it actually agrees with the Talmudic halakha. So a lot of people will quote Matthew chapter 15 when Yeshua talks about the traditions of men as if he is deriding Pharisaic halakha when he says that. But if you actually understand the Pharisaic halakha, he's actually been agreeing with the Talmudic Pharisaic halachot, or halakha in this issue. Halachot is plural. Halakha, he actually agrees with them against the group that he is disagreeing with. So he's agreeing with the Talmud, if you will, against the group that he attacks for holding what he calls traditions of men. So he's not calling the Talmudic traditions of men because he's agreeing with it. He's calling a different position traditions of men. So if you ever see somebody that's quoting the phrase and using the phrase traditions of men in reference to the Talmud, they obviously don't understand Matthew 15, or they've never bothered to see what the Talmudic tradition on that issue is, because if you do the research and you look at it, you'll find out that the Yeshua's teaching and the Talmud are in agreement, and that it's some third party that Yeshua is calling position that he's calling traditions of men that's not a Talmudic tradition. Okay, that's just a side note. Did a whole video on that several years ago in my introduction to the Talmud class. So you go back and watch those videos, and I spent a whole video discussing that particular issue. All right. So one of the issues is light and heavy, because sometimes one commandment will outweigh another, and you'll have to violate one commandment in order to keep the other one. But the principle is it's not really violating a commandment. Technically, it means that the commandment is loosed um, uh, in that case. All right, the next principle in Rabbinic Halacha, with my whistler here, that I want to cover is called Pikuach Nefesh. Um, Pikuach Nefesh is, by the way, we're here on our handout on Rabbinic Halacha. We covered Kol Vechomer, light and heavy. Um, and the next one I said is Pikuach Nefesh, and which means watching over a soul. It's the or watching over a life. And it's the principle in Jewish law that the preservation of human life overrides virtually any other religious rule, any other mitzvah. When the life of a specific person is in danger, almost any negative commandment of the Torah becomes inapplicable. Um, so the problem here is, well, let's begin. Let's talk about the basis for this. The basis for this is found in the Torah in Leviticus 18:5, where it says, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my ordinances, which if a man do, he shall live by them. I am Yahweh." Notice that I boldface the phrase, "He shall live by them." And Ezekiel 20:11 in the Nevi'im says, "I gave my statutes and taught them my ordinances, which if a man do them, he shall live by them." So the Torah is supposed to give life. The intent of the Torah is to be life-giving. Any application of Torah that takes life, virtually any application, is invalid, therefore, a misapplication of Torah. There are only a handful of commandments that can't be violated for that reason, 3 actually. One of them is murder. Obviously, there's no logic in killing one person to save another. Another one is sexual immorality, and the last one is idolatry. But anything else is on the table when it comes to a human life being at stake. And this is stated in the Mishnah in Tractate Yoma 8:6. Rabbi Mattiah ben Harash said, "He who has a pain in his throat, they drop medicine into his throat on the Sabbath because it is a matter of doubt as to danger of life. Any matter of doubt as to danger of life overrides the prohibitions of the Sabbath." That's Mishnah Yoma 8:6. But there's a big caveat to that. It's got to be a human life at stake. In the Mishnah Shabbat 2:6, chapter 22, section 6, it's also found, well, let's just stop there. It's in the Mishnah. We read, "They anoint and massage the stomach, but they do not have it kneaded or scraped. They do not induce vomiting, but they do not straighten the limb of a child or set a broken limb. He whose hand or foot is dislocated should not pour cold water over him, but he washes it in the usual way, and if he is healed, he is healed." So it's not just a matter of health or preventing somebody from injury or treating an injury or an illness. It has to be a situation where a human life is at stake. That is the principle, and there are problems there. I've heard an account, for example, of a Hasidic group that was having a Shabbat meeting in a private home, and in the course of the meeting, the Shabbat candle touched a drape or fell over and hit a drape and started a fire. And since it was easy enough to filter everybody out of the house, usher everybody out of the house safely, everybody simply vacated the house and allowed it to burn. Because as long as every human life was safe, then the house itself burning to the ground didn't threaten anybody's life. So there were a lot of, I would say, problems with that Halacha, and we're going to deal with that when we get to Yeshua's Halacha. Now, the Essenes were even stricter, and they held to a Halacha that man is beneath the Torah. I would say under the Torah. That's a very familiar phrase that we see Paul use, and that's what he is referring to. But to give it new life, I've worded it that man is beneath the Torah. In Wars of the Jews, Josephus points out that the Essenes are stricter, are stricter than any other of the Jews, resting from their labors on the seventh day, for they only get their food ready the day beforehand, and they do not be obliged to kindle a fire on that day, but they will not remove any out of its place, nor go to stool thereon. They won't even go out of their place to go to the bathroom. In other words, they won't go outside to the latrine. There is a lengthy discussion of the Sabbath Halacha of the Essenes in the Damascus document in the Dead Sea Scrolls. No man shall eat on the Sabbath day. This is in your handout here, by the way, on the page on Essene Halacha. This is from the Damascus document, column 10, line 14 through column 11, line 18. No man shall eat on the Sabbath day aught save that which is prepared in perishing in the field, nor shall one eat or drink unless in the camp. If he was on the way and went down to wash, he may drink where he stands, but he shall not draw into any vessel. No man shall walk after the animal to pasture it outside his city more than 2,000 cubits. No man shall lift his hand to smite it with his fist. If it be stubborn, the animal, he shall not remove it out of his house. No man shall carry anything from the house to the outside, or from the outside into the house. And if he be in the vestibule, he shall not carry anything out of it to bring anything into it. Let not the nursing father take the sucking child to go out to come in on the Sabbath. No man shall help an animal in its delivery on the Sabbath day. And if it falls into a ditch, a pit or ditch, he shall not raise it on the Sabbath. And if any person falls into a place of water, or into a place of, it's missing something where the worms ate it, he shall not bring him up by a ladder or a cord or instrument. No man shall offer anything on the altar of the Sabbath, save the burnt offering of the Sabbath, for it is written, accepting your Sabbaths. So the key phrase here is, if any person falls into a place of water or into a place of something, he shall not bring him up by a ladder or a cord or any instrument. In other words, it's better to let him die than to lift your hands using a tool on the Sabbath, thus working. So in the Essene Halacha, a man was less important than the Sabbath, because a man was less important than the Torah. In other words, man is beneath the Torah, or under the Torah, in the Essene Halacha, which is what Paul's speaking about when he criticizes the under the law teaching. By the way, you'll notice also it talks about not rescuing an animal from a pit on the Sabbath, which Yeshua directly addresses in Matthew 12, which we'll talk about. So now I want to talk about Yeshua's Halacha, and the Sabbath gives us a good example here again to learn some things about Yeshua's Halacha. The first is Mark 2, chapter 27. Chapter 22, verse 27, I'm sorry. The Sabbath was created for man and not man for the Sabbath. This is very similar to something we read in the Talmud. In Yoma 85b, Rabbi Jonathan ben Yosef said, "For it is holy unto you," speaking of the Sabbath, quoting Exodus 30:22 and Exodus 31:14. "It is committed to your hands, not you to its hands." So, Rabbi Jonathan ben Joseph makes a rule from these two passages that the Sabbath is committed. This is one of the rules of Hillel, by the way. The Sabbath is committed to your hands, not you into its hands. The halakhic argument here is based on this passage, "For it is holy unto you," the Sabbath is holy unto you. And the phrase is also found in relation to the Jubilee year in Leviticus 25:12, that it is holy unto you. Based on the fourth rule of Hillel, building a rule on two or more passages, we can now generalize this principle from the Sabbath in specific to the Torah in general, which is important here because Yeshua is saying essentially the same thing on the same basis. However, Rabbi Jonathan ben Joseph in the Talmud has preserved the Torah passage that's the basis for it. This is, "For it is holy unto you." In the Hebrew, the phrase "to you" in this passage is Lamed Kaf Mem Sofit, which in Hebrew indicates the possession of ownership. For example, if I want to say Yochanan's book in Hebrew, I would literally say the book that is to Yochanan. So in Hebrew, there's this implication that if the Sabbath is holy to you, and if the Jubilee is holy to you, that it belongs to you. If it's yours, you're not its. Therefore, it is under you, you're not under it. This is the a disagreement with the under the law position of the Essenes. This is the position that that the Torah was created for you and not you for the Torah. The Torah was made for you and not you for the Torah. The Torah is holy unto you, not you to the Torah. It's been committed to your hands, not you into its hands. The Torah is for you. So we derive the halakhic principle from this teaching of Yeshua that the Torah is under man or beneath man, and that man is not beneath the Torah or under the Torah. And this is again what Paul talks about in, for example, Galatians, the under the law teaching, which is contrary to Yeshua's teaching that we're not under the law, the Torah is under us. We're not, the Torah wasn't, we weren't created for the Torah for its benefit. The Torah was created for our benefit. We weren't committed into the hands of the Torah was committed into our hands, and so on. All right, this is a very important halakhic principle. In theory, it's shared with the Pharisees in that it's quoted and that it's cited also parallel, has this close parallel with the Talmud here. But there's a caveat that we'll get to, a little difference. So now let's look at our next handout, Chesed. The next principle, the first principle of Nazarene Halacha is that the Torah was created for the benefit of man, not vice versa. The second principle of Nazarene Halacha is Chesed outweighs sacrificial offerings. Now, to understand what Chesed is, the word Chesed in Hebrew, it's translated, I think, mercy in Hosea 6:6, which is going to be cited here by Yeshua. Hosea 6:6 is the basis for this rule. It's not the full basis, it's actually expounding upon it, because the Torah comes, Hosea can't make up Torah. Hosea can only elaborate on Torah. So Hosea is actually elaborating on the principle that we already learned, that the Torah that is in the Torah, or is based on the Torah, that the Sabbath is holy onto you, and therefore committed to you, and you not to it, and therefore the principle that the Torah was created for the benefit of man and not vice versa. So Hosea doesn't get to make up Torah, but as a prophet, Hosea does get to expound upon Torah and explain what it means. And so that's what he's done here. All right, so we get to Matthew chapter 12. We're going to do verses 7 through 13 here. We have it here in the handout. But if you had known, this is Yeshua speaking, if you had known what it means, for I desire mercy and not, oh, that's it. We were talking about what chesed means. So chesed means mercy or grace or undue favor. Sometimes even it's translated love. Those are the meanings of the word chesed. So, but if you had known what it means, for I desire chesed or mercy and not sacrifice, Hosea 6:6, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Adonai even of the Sabbath. And by the way, Mark's account is exactly where, between verses 8 and verse 9, Mark's account of this same incident is where we have the rule, the principle, the Sabbath was created for man and not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2:27. That actually fits right there in the event. And then verse 9, and when he had passed over from there, he entered into their synagogue. And behold, a man which had his hand withered, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful on the Sabbath to heal the sick? And all of this was that they might accuse him before the Beit Din. And he said to them, what man among you, having one sheep that shall fall into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold on it and lift it up? Now you remember we saw in the Essene Halacha, an Essene would do just that, but a Pharisee would not. So Yeshua is appealing to his Pharisee audience saying, wouldn't you agree with me that that's wrong? Okay, and he's directly quoting the Essene, effectively quoting the Essene Halacha in the Damascus document here. To his Pharisee audience to rally their support. And then he says, and is not a man better than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then said he unto the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored to health like the other. Now, there's a whole bunch more I could talk about this passage, and will someday when I do a video going through the book of Matthew. And in my commentary on Matthew, if you go to NazareneSpace.com and go NazareneSpace.com/blog and click on the scripture commentaries link, my commentary to Matthew 12 covers this in more detail. But Yeshua is here quoting Hosea 6:6, for I desire mercy or chesed and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of Elohim rather than burnt offerings. This is also why he says in Yochanan chapter 7, verse 23, if a man is circumcised on the day of the Sabbath, that the Torah of Moshe be not loosed, do you murmur against me because I have healed a whole man on the Sabbath day? And that also has a parallel in the Talmud, in Babylonian Talmud Yoma 85b. Rabbi Eliezer answered and said, if circumcision, which attaches to only one of the 248 members of the human body, suspends the Sabbath, how much more shall the saving of the whole body suspend the Sabbath? Of course, Rabbi Eliezer here is arguably only, in the rabbinic understanding at least, only referring to saving the life of the individual. Yeshua is actually discussing, talking about healing the individual. In fact, he had a withered hand and his life didn't seem to be at risk. Verse 12, back up in chapter 12, verse 12 of Matthew, And is not a man better than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. In the Hebrew, the words better and good are both tov. So there's a direct connection there. If a man is more tov than a sheep, it is lawful to do tov on the Sabbath, being the concluding concept here. So from this, we draw a principle that not just the life of a man, but the health of a man outweighs the Sabbath. And in fact, doing a good deed, if you will, doing an act of mercy or chesed, an act of chesed, of loving kindness to another individual, outweighs the Sabbath. In other words, we don't turn our back on an individual when we have our opportunity to do an act of loving kindness for them and say, oh no, I can't do that, it's the Sabbath. All right. So from this, we derive the principle. Now, how does Yeshua derive this principle? Let me explain. From Hosea 6:6. We know that the sacrifices were performed on the Sabbath. Okay, that's in the Torah. Sacrificial offerings were done on the Sabbath. Since the sacrificial offerings were done on the Sabbath, that means that the sacrificial offerings outweigh the Sabbath. Remember, we have this concept of weight. Let's talk about that. The rabbinic concept of weight we mentioned. Let's talk about Yeshua's concept of weight. In Matthew, I think it's chapter 23, verse 23. Let's look that up real quick. In Matthew 23, verse 23. Yeshua says, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay the tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the Torah, judgment, mercy, or chesed, and faith, emunah. These ought you to have done, and not leave the other undone. So here we have this concept of weightier. Some commandments are weightier than others in Yeshua's teaching. So now we have this concept here that we know from the Torah that the Sabbath, that the sacrificial offerings are up here in weight, in priority, and that the Sabbath is down here. The sacrificial offerings are down here. The Sabbath is subservient to them, less than them, if you will, because they're performed on the Sabbath. So they have a higher priority than the Sabbath. And so since they have a higher priority than the Sabbath, and Hosea is teaching us that chesed has a higher priority than the sacrificial offerings, that therefore, if the sacrificial offerings have greater weight, if chesed has greater weight than the sacrificial offerings, and the sacrificial offerings have greater weight than the Sabbath, then chesed has a greater weight than the Sabbath, as a matter of logic. From this we learn then that chesed has a greater weight than not just the Sabbath, but also the sacrificial offerings. Okay, not just the sacrificial offerings, but also the Sabbath. Okay, and that goes into Yochanan 7:23, because another thing that's done on the Sabbath is, and this is both in Yochanan 7:23, and it's also discussed and covered in the Talmud, that circumcision is for an eighth day circumcision. If the eighth day after birth falls on a Sabbath, we still do the circumcision on the Sabbath, and so that means that the circumcision has a higher priority than the Sabbath. Okay. So there's other things that we can learn then from this. This gives us a general principle of Halacha that we can apply to other matters. Because if we can find another mitzvah that has greater weight or less weight, than the sacrificial offerings or than the Sabbath, either one, then we know that chesed has higher priority than either of those, then it must have higher priority than this other mitzvah. I'm going to give you an example of a thing that we can learn, something learned, okay, from this analysis that goes. It's a remez. It's beyond what this is plainly taught by Yeshua, and then extends it and says, I learned, you taught me how to do this, now let me apply it to a different problem. So let me apply it to a different problem. Let's say that you are sick, and the only medication available for your illness is made from a non-kosher animal. Is it permissible to take medication for an illness? Let's say it's not even life-threatening, but it's an illness that is made from a non-kosher animal. So the question is then, the unkosher animal, eating something unkosher, what is the penalty? Let's start with, what is the penalty for violating the Sabbath? Death. Okay, the penalty for violating the Sabbath is death. What is the penalty for eating unkosher food? Well, it's not death. It's that you're unclean until evening. You're washed and you're unclean until evening. Okay, that's the penalty. So that means the kashrut, the kosher laws, are of less weight than the Sabbath. Okay, kashrut are of less weight than the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is of less weight than the sacrificial offerings, and the sacrificial offerings are of less weight than chesed, than acts of loving kindness or mercy. Therefore, acts of loving kindness and mercy outweigh the kashrut. Therefore, healing someone, treating an illness that is not even necessarily a life-threatening illness, but an illness or an injury that's also not life-threatening, through the use of a medication that's made from an unkosher animal, is permitted under Yeshua's Halacha. The logic is inescapable. Now, in Rabbinic Halacha, it's permitted if the life is threatened. But here, is simply a matter of health. Okay. Now, if a kosher alternative is available, you should use that. This is only if there is no alternative, and there is the only medication available is made from an unkosher animal, then you should absolutely use that rather than put a person's health or your own health at risk. Okay. This, of course, necessitates the fact that the idea that of required in this is, of course, that the medication actually would benefit the health of the person to take it. All right. So that's an example. There are many other applications we could make. In fact, this gives us a general principle of Yeshua's Halacha that is far-reaching and will allow us to develop a great many halachot and do critical analysis of a great many rabbinic halachot that are recorded in the Mishnah Torah and so on, in some of the delineations, if you will, of Pharisaic or rabbinic halachot. All right. I want to also go further into another thing that we can learn. Remember, Yeshua's quoting Hosea 6:6, "For I desire mercy and not sacrifice," or "I desire chesed and not sacrifice," which Yeshua understands then to mean that chesed has a greater weight than the sacrifices, and therefore a greater weight than anything that the sacrifices have a greater weight than themselves, such as the Sabbath, and as I pointed out, the kashrut. So Hosea 6:6, then, though, in poetic parallelism, the next phrase of Hosea 6:6, and that's our next handout, is, and the knowledge of Elohim rather than burnt offerings. Now, we know that burnt offerings are done on the Sabbath, even though they normally would be prohibited. In fact, burning anything is normally prohibited on the Sabbath, right? So the burnt offerings would normally be prohibited on the Sabbath, but they're specifically permitted, therefore they outweigh the Sabbath. And now we know, just like Chesed outweighs the Sabbath, and now we know that the knowledge of Elohim has the same weight, well, we don't know that it has the same weight of Chesed. We could only presume that, but it has the same quality of being of greater weight than the sacrificial offerings, specifically the burnt offerings, and of the therefore greater weight than the Sabbath, and anything that is of lesser weight than the burnt offerings or the Sabbath. Okay, so what are some applications? In Rabbinic Halacha, it's prohibited to drive beyond the normally, well, it's prohibited to drive on the Sabbath because a car is an internal combustion engine, and the Torah specifically prohibits causing something to burn, causing combustion. Therefore, driving on the Sabbath would violate the Torah commandments concerning the Sabbath. However, the Sabbath is loosed then in matters concerning the knowledge of Elohim. So if you're going to synagogue to go study Torah, it is permitted to drive under Yeshua's Halacha, because we can learn something new here by taking what Yeshua taught us and then deriving. So we've got two principles that we've been able to derive. One, that Chesed outweighs the sacrifices, and that Chesed outweighs the sacrificial offerings, and therefore anything that they are above. And then also the knowledge of Elohim. We were able to apply this not just to the Sabbath, but other things besides the Sabbath. For example, the question of whether an unkosher animal can be, whether you can take medication made from an unkosher animal if that's the alternative to treat an illness. Okay, so these are some basic principles of Yeshua's Halacha. It's apparent that certain Pharisees agreed with Yeshua on this back in the Second Temple era. And let me see if I can pull this up. I didn't have it. I may add this to the notes later. Well, no, it's just right in the scriptures, but let me pull it up here so I've got it in my notes. I think actually it was here. So it is from this that we derive we could call this principle that we've learned about Chesed. Remember I said one of the possible translations of Chesed is grace. So now you see why Paul talks about being under grace or under Chesed as opposed to being under the law, because the Essenes teaching was that a man was beneath the Torah. One could argue to a certain extent the Pharisaic teaching did not go far enough, in that a human life had to be at stake, not just merely an act of charity, if you will. That's another meaning of the word chesed. So when Yeshua was talking with one of the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 22, turn to Matthew 22, starting in verse 34. going through verse 40. But when the Parashim, or the Pharisees, heard that he had silenced the Zedekim, or the Sadducees, they took counsel together. And one of them, which was a doctor of the Torah, asked him and tested him and said to him, Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment of the Torah? And Yeshua answered and said, You shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your nefesh, and with all your might. That is, of course, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, the opening of the Shema. Verse 38, this is the greatest commandment in the whole Torah. Verse 39, and this is the first, but the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the Torah and the prophets. Now, that would be seeming to indicate that they were the highest priority. Leviticus 19:18, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is one of the passages he quoted, the second passage he quoted here. And if we turn to Mark chapter 12, verses 32 through 34, we see the conversation continues here in Mark. I started in Matthew because I like Matthew, first of all, and second of all, because Matthew identifies him specifically as a Pharisee that he's talking with. Mark calls him a scribe. Verse 32, the scribe said to him, Good Rabbi, you have spoken in truth, because he is one, and there are no others apart from him. So the Pharisee is liking what Yeshua said. Verse 33, and that a man should love him with all his heart and with his entire mind and with all his nefesh and with all his might, and that he should love his neighbor as himself. Greater is this than all offerings and sacrifices. Now, seems here that this particular Pharisee is agreeing with Yeshua's concept. It's Hosea 6:6 chesed priority thing. He has what he has done is he's conflated two passages, Leviticus 19:18 with Hosea 6:6, and substituted that he should love his neighbor as himself, loving one's neighbor for chesed, and he's equated them. So Yeshua, he seems to agree here with Yeshua's teaching. That's very important. Remember, I said Halacha was fluid in the Second Temple era, and here's a Pharisee that was agreeing with Yeshua's teaching here, invoking Hosea 6:6. It also is helpful for us to understand that the chesed in Hosea 6:6 can be equated with love your neighbor as yourself, which therefore could be plugged in place of chesed, and therefore would also be an example of chesed. Prioritize loving your neighbor as yourself is prioritized above the sacrificial offerings, and therefore above the Sabbath, and therefore above anything that has less than a death penalty. So there's so much that we can learn from the Halacha that Yeshua shares with us. Now, this also, now you see, I mentioned one of the meanings of chesed is grace. When Paul talks about under grace, he's talking about under chesed. Paul is contrasting under chesed, which is Yeshua's teaching that a man is under chesed, with the Essenes teaching that man is under the law, or beneath the law. The law is more important than he is. And Yeshua has exactly the opposite position, that man is more important than the Torah, and therefore an act of chesed is of higher priority than the Torah, and certainly than the sacrificial offerings, or anything that that those are have greater weight than, or anything that is less weight than the sacrificial offerings, including the Sabbath, the kashrut, and anything that has less than a death penalty attached to it. All right. I hope you've learned something. We may do some more of these, touching on some other halakhic issues that Yeshua teaches, and also maybe addressing the concept and the reasoning of a Nazarene halakhic body, a Beit Din, a Nazarene Beit Din, apart from and separate from the Rabbinic halakhic authority and the Rabbinic Beit Dins and Rabbinic authorities. Okay, that's a whole nother issue, but we have some real good tools here that Yeshua has given us. He's pointed the way and said, "Here's some basic principles. Now take this ball and run with it." And from these, we can derive a whole body of Nazarene Halacha that makes sense, that has um, that's systematic and makes sense and is alternative to Pharisaic Halacha. And then we can, as we build that structure, we can look at Pharisaic Halacha and measure it against these principles that we have from Yeshua. All right. So I hope that you've learned something from this. Very important, I need to add here. Um, we do this work based upon your tithes, offerings, gifts, whatnot. I do this full time. I do this from home primarily, and that is because 3 years ago, my wife had a surgery that left her in the hospital for 53 days. So she had septic shock. She was in ICU twice. She barely survived. She came home, and she's never been the same since. And she's chronically ill. She's disabled, and she suffers from chronic pain. And so I do most of my work at a table about 6 feet away from her, where I'm her caretaker and available to help her as needed. So she has if you're watching this today, August 15th, 2021, she's having a she's having a surgical procedure tomorrow. And that's going to cost us out of pocket $350 that we just don't have. So uh, we need donations. We're hitting some really hard times in the next few days um, that we're going to have a hard time covering some of these costs that are hitting us in the next week to 2 weeks. And so if you can step up and donate, please send donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. That's W as in world, N as in Nazarene, A as in assembly, and E as in Elohim. WNAE.org. That's donations plural donations with an S on the end, at WNAE.org. If you can only donate a little, great. If you can make a big donation, we be really helpful if some people can make a one-time donation of $500 or $1,000. But if you can just donate $20, $50 or whatever you can donate, we really need your help. All right. And hopefully these teachings that we're doing help you. All right. Shabbat Shalom. Well, it's not Shabbat. I'm just kind of used to saying that. Shalom, everybody. And we'll talk to you again in the next study. Shalom.